Some beliefs feel like scars. You didn't choose them, you inherited them, but they still shape how you see yourself. And maybe, somewhere along the way, you stopped questioning them and just started building a life around them. This is The Void and the Flame, a space for burning down the lies you were told and rebuilding in truth. I'm Rachel, or Ray, hypnotist, NLP practitioner, life coach, and someone who spent a long time trying to break free from the blueprints that were never mine to begin with. Now, last week we cracked open the voice in your head. This week, we're going deeper to the root beliefs underneath the thoughts, the ones that were formed when you were too young to question them, the ones that became part of your personality, and the ones you're finally ready to let go of. Somewhere in the quiet, in the space between your thoughts, there's a map of you. Not a map of where you've been, but of how you've been taught to walk through the world. Every path drawn in ink you never chose. Every road labeled with someone else's words. This is your blueprint. You've been living inside it so long, you started to believe its walls are the edges of who you are. But here's the thing. You didn't build this place. Some parts were sketched in by family, others by teachers, lovers, strangers, and some pieces weren't gently drawn at all. They were carved in by sharp moments, split-second decisions you didn't get to make. The question isn't just what is written there, it's who wrote it, and why have you been letting them hold the pen? When I was around 7, my life was already full of change, moving from place to place, trying to find some sense of stability. At that time, my family was going through a big transition, and soon the adoption process for me would begin. A process that would reshape my identity, my relationships, and everything I thought I knew about family. It's always been very hard for me to remember much of my childhood clearly. Something I learned later is pretty common for trauma survivors. But during that time, I had to come face to face with a man I barely knew. Only through limited stories or fragments I had been told. I was 8 years old the first time I remembered meeting my biological father. I remember only pieces of that day clearly. The most vivid memories aren't always the warm ones. I remember the way my feet dangled just above the floor as I sat there, watching the door open. He didn't look like a stranger, but he didn't look like someone I knew either. There was no familiar warmth to step into, just a polite kind of curiosity. I had wondered for years if meeting him would make something inside me click, like I'd suddenly understand who I was or where I came from. But all I felt was a strange, quiet awkwardness, like we were both looking for something in the other that we didn't find that day. My mother had made a choice when I was just a baby to walk away from my biological father and never let him see me again. But when he came over to sign his rights away, we got to spend some time together. It was the first time I could remember truly interacting with the man who was half of my genetic makeup, who helped create me and bring me into this world, standing at my door, about to sign a piece of paper stating I was no longer his daughter. I remember he had built me a bike, one I was far too small to ride at the time, but it was the thought that counted. And when he left, he gave me his hat and a little voice recorder with a tape inside. He had recorded some things he wanted to say to me. I never got to listen to that recording. As I sat on our front porch wearing his hat, ready to hear what he'd left for me, my mom ripped the headphones off my head and took the player and tape away. For all I know, she tossed it out like trash on a Sunday morning. It's been 33 years, and I still wonder what he wanted to tell me. I feel slighted that I never got that chance. That instead of holding on to it for me, maybe for when I was a little older, she just threw it away. I think that was the first moment I started to see my mother differently. But it also shaped how I saw my biological father for the rest of my life, because I never heard his story, his voice, which might have changed how I felt many years later. There were conflicting stories about what really happened to break that relationship apart. To this day, I still don't know the full truth. But about a year later, it was the middle of the school year, and I was 9. We had moved into our first house in Mattydale. Once we moved in, that's when my mom really started to change. She started skirting her responsibilities as a mother, and I ended up having to pick up those responsibilities because she wasn't doing it, and someone had to. She would sleep all day while my dad was at work, and then get up shortly before he came home, trying to play off like she'd done everything around the house, that it was all her doing. And, it did look that way. But really, the quiet, unspoken truth was, it was mine. I didn't tell my dad what was happening, at least not that I remember. I can't even fully remember how he found out. And I'm not sure if he found out while she was still living with us, pretending to play family, or after she had made the decision to leave. We hadn't even been living in that house for a full year yet when, around Christmas time, my mom decided to pack up in the middle of the night and leave while we were all asleep. We woke up the next morning to a note, and she was gone. She had chosen her friends, her drinking, her new lover, over the 3 children she brought into the world. At that point, my adoption had been finalized for several months. The man I had always called Dad may not have been my father by blood, but he was the only father I had ever known since I was not even 2. He was officially my father, by name, by heart, and by choice. I'm thankful for that, because I honestly don't know where life would have taken me had it not been for carrying his last name when my mom chose to walk away. I sometimes wonder if my mom waited to walk away until that adoption process was complete, because then she would know that when she left, he would take care of me. I like to believe, though, that even if I hadn't carried his last name at that time, he would have still fought tooth and nail to be involved in my life and to keep my brothers and I together. It just may have been harder. I was 9 years old in a new school with a new identity and a new set of responsibilities I never asked for. I want you to imagine for a moment how heavy that transition must have been for a 9-year-old who was completely unprepared. And yet, there I was, having to become a mother to children I didn't create while still being a child myself. Every morning, I would get my brothers up, dressed, and ready for school. I made sure they got on the bus safely. I came home and made sure there was food in their bellies and everything was taken care of before my dad came home. Because again, he didn't know what was really happening. He didn't know my mom was sleeping on the couch all day after having been out all night. Can you imagine carrying that kind of pressure, stress, and responsibility on shoulders that were way too small for it? On top of everything else, one of my brothers had extra needs that required more care and attention, not because he was difficult, but because life had dealt us a very different set of challenges. Even though it was relatively easy compared to some, that was still an added layer of responsibility for a 9-year-old to carry. Life shifted pretty rapidly shortly after my dad found out what was going on. My dad was a very hard worker. He worked his ass off to support us. My mom, she rarely worked. And from what I've heard later in life and some of what I had seen during this time period and the decades to follow, she spent a lot of her time focused on her friends and her drinking and spending time with other men who were not my dad. I don't want to say that she was never involved, but after she left, she became the every other weekend parent. But to be 9, to have just recently been adopted, had a name change, a school change, an entirely new life, and then to go into a situation where you're raising your brothers because you love them and want to make sure they're taken care of, knowing your mom won't. That was a weight I'm still not sure how I carried at that tender age of 9, but it shaped who I became moving forward. For decades, I've lived out the blueprint of being the quiet, perfect helper, the responsible one, the one who held everything together, even when it wasn't my job. Honestly, that experience turned me into the mother of every group I became involved in. I became the caretaker, the fixer, the one who made sure everyone else was taken care of, often at the expense of my own needs. It was in those moments that the blueprint solidified for me. It solidified for me that when I became a mother myself, I would never be that kind of mother. There are parts of my experience that helped guide me in different directions to break the generational curses I was born into. But it also caused a lot of stress, blind spots that I couldn't see for a long time. It's only been recently in the last several years that I've started to see this story more clearly, to realize that while I was carrying this weight for so long, it was never truly mine to carry to begin with. This story is just one example of how blueprints are handed down to us, ways we learn to survive and cope, patterns we inherit that shape our lives long before we have any say. A blueprint isn't just an idea for a building, it's the plan the entire structure is built from. In our lives, the blueprint is our subconscious programming, the beliefs, rules, and quiet instructions we follow without even realizing it. It starts forming before we can speak. Maybe you were told you only get attention when you behave a certain way, or we don't talk about that, or you have to earn love by being useful. You hear it enough times and it becomes a beam in your foundation. And by the time you're grown, the house feels solid. But you can't figure out why certain doors won't open or why the light never quite reaches some rooms. That's because you're still living inside an architecture designed for a version of you that existed long ago. And here's the kicker. Not all of it was built for joy. Some of it was built for survival in dangerous conditions. And sometimes those old safety measures start to feel like prisons. So now that we understand what a blueprint is, those invisible inherited instructions running our lives, how do we start to change it? Well, you begin by paying attention. Start noticing when you react in ways that feel automatic, confusing, or maybe even frustrating. Maybe you find yourself snapping at someone over something small, apologizing when you haven't done anything wrong, or shrinking in a room without even knowing why. When you catch yourself in those moments, pause, take a breath, ask yourself, whose voice am I hearing right now? Is this really my reaction, or am I echoing a belief or expectation someone else placed on me? To make this easier, keep a simple list or a journal this week. And every time you notice one of these automatic reactions, jot down, what happened? How did you feel in that moment? Was there a particular place in your body where you felt it more? What thought or voice do you think was behind that feeling? Where might that thought have come from? A parent? A teacher? Past experience? And here's something important. It's okay if you don't know exactly where that thought came from, or if you're not sure you're right. The act of noticing and asking is what matters. Awareness itself starts to loosen the hold those old patterns have on you. Be gentle with yourself in this process. It's normal for this kind of self exploration to bring up uncomfortable feelings or confusion. If that happens, just pause, take a few deep breaths, recenter. Remind yourself that you are doing important work and it's okay to take it slow. If you feel overwhelmed, consider reaching out to somebody you trust, or writing in a journal is a safe space to process. This isn't about changing yourself overnight, it's about curiosity and compassion. The goal is to map your internal landscape so that you can begin to understand the blueprint you've been living by. And as you do this, you may notice patterns, beliefs, or rules that pop up again and again. That's your blueprint revealing itself, and that's powerful. Because when you can see the structure you're living inside, you gain the power to decide, what parts do I keep? What parts do I rewrite? And what parts do I finally release? Well, that's it for this episode of Avoiding the Flame. If it lit something in you, if it sparked clarity or cracked something open, share it with someone else who's ready to unlearn what was never theirs. Leave a review, follow the show, or just come back next week. You don't have to change everything overnight. Just keep showing up. Until then, keep the fire lit.